For centuries, knowledge has been hidden in plain sight across the sands of time. Whispers of lost civilizations, cryptic symbols, and forbidden histories have been erased or concealed. What if the truth was never lost, but hidden? Welcome to Eye of Ancient Mysteries, where the past speaks and the future listens. Sit back, open your mind, and prepare to uncover the untold secrets of our world. Let the journey begin now. It's hard not to believe he saw something. Historian Greg Eghigian on how UFOs took over the world. What do UFO sightings tell us about ourselves? And will they ever be explained? Historian Greg Eghigian told me how he's trying to find out. Strange lights in the sky, little green men, and crashed ships hidden away in government laboratories. The relatively modern history of UFOs is full of conspiracy theories and claims of cover-ups. But beyond the endless debates between believers and skeptics about what might be behind these phenomena, one fact remains. Many people have looked to the sky and reported seeing things they could not explain. So what do UFO reports tell us about ourselves? To discuss UFO sightings, how and why they first appeared, and how they relate to the cultural and political trends of the past and present, we had to sit down for an informal conversation. Many people assume that UFOs entered public consciousness with the Roswell incident. But your book argues otherwise. When did it all begin? I think that when we look at this as a social phenomenon, not just someone seeing something strange in the sky, but an object supposedly made by someone, with one likely scenario being that it was extraterrestrial, we can identify the moment that began to unfold on June 24, 1947. Private pilot Kenneth Arnold saw these objects that day over Washington State while flying his plane. He landed and reported it to both the military and journalists. When asked how they flew, he replied that the things flew like saucers skipping on water. Then, within a day or two, a journalist came up with that brilliant headline, "Flying Saucers." Once we had flying saucers, everything else fell into place. But then, just a few weeks later, Roswell happened. How did a relatively small town in New Mexico become world famous for UFOs, while Arnold's name remained relatively unknown? Here's something about Roswell that many people don't realize. The story that came out of Roswell was that some material had been recovered near the air base there, and they thought it might be from a crashed flying saucer. Within a day, the Air Force retracted that, saying it wasn't true, that the people who found it were mistaken. In reality, the people on the ground who discovered the debris weren't particularly qualified to speak about it. They didn't really understand what they were holding in their hands, and the people who normally handled such material were actually away at a conference. When they finally got a look at it, they said, "Oh, this is pretty mundane stuff," and corrected the report. So the Roswell incident got a lot of airtime, a lot of global news coverage for about 24 to 48 hours. And then it vanished. It was never really talked about again and left only a tiny imprint on the UFO world for decades. It wasn't until the late 1970s that some ufologists, and this is very common in the UFO world, went back to the records, dug into the story, and decided they'd found all these inconsistencies. That's when Roswell became a focal point. If we look at the historical period when this all began, we see rising Cold War rivalry, a new existential threat from nuclear weapons, McCarthyism, fear of communism, and Soviet Russia. It seems like a time ripe for paranoia and conspiracy. How much of all this UFO stuff is connected to that? Oh, very much so. In my book, I argue that I don't think the UFO phenomenon, as we know it, would exist without the Cold War. There are several reasons for that, but one often forgotten aspect is World War II. World War II and the Cold War brought several critical elements to how UFO stories were built. First, you have big governments and big militaries. If you look at the U.S. federal government in 1900, it wasn't a big thing, not that kind of monster. By 1945, the U.S. government had become a huge bureaucracy with a massive army. Second, what World War II taught everyone was that this kind of institution could have secret programs building remarkable technologies, like the atomic bomb and new kinds of aircraft, such as jets. And of course, both conflicts also involved a lot of espionage. So when the UFO phenomenon appeared, the initial thought almost everyone had was that this must be the work of one of the superpowers, someone conducting surveillance. That's also how people still talk about it today. Who's doing this? Who's keeping it secret? What are their intentions? And could it hurt us? That's a big part of it, and it's haunted UFO history for decades. There were also interesting precedents before Kenneth Arnold in 1947. One that comes to mind is Orson Welles' 1938 radio broadcast of War of the Worlds, which caused mass panic that aliens were actually invading. Why did flying saucers take off in 1947 and not earlier? I think the atomic bomb was the turning point. Something we had no idea existed was suddenly revealed to the world. A thing with such enormous destructive power that it could wipe out all humanity in an instant. When you ask, why now? Some people say that alien visitors have always been here. We just only notice them now. But the argument usually presented is that perhaps the aliens started noticing us because we began detonating atomic bombs. That made us capable of communicating with them, or potentially a threat in the future. There's also an appeal to a higher power there, right? In a time when religion was fading, after all the horrors of the past century, people were looking for something that could save us from ourselves. There are certainly people who believe exactly that. The figure who articulated it best was the psychologist Carl Jung. In the late 1950s, he wrote one of the first, and still one of the best, scholarly books on the subject. He argued that, real or not, what UFOs represented for people was the idea of salvation, or at least the hope for it. In the early 1950s, you even begin to see religious communities based on UFOs, most of them connected to the emerging New Age movement. Everything you've said so far makes this sound like a distinctly mid 20th century American phenomenon. But what about claims that UFO sightings appear across cultures and even in the distant past, like Ancient Aliens suggests? Is that real or retrofitted? That's a question people debate quite passionately. There's no doubt that humans have reported seeing strange things in the sky since ancient times. The most famous example is probably meteorites. For a long time, the idea that stones could fall from the sky seemed absurd, until people discovered that space is full of rocks. The problem with looking backward and saying, "Ha! Here's another UFO example," is that it's deeply problematic from a historical perspective. In most cases, it involves unintentional or even deliberate misinterpretation of documents, artifacts, or paintings. I've seen very good art historians, for example, point to paintings and exclaim, "Oh my God, those are obviously flying saucers," when the objects in question are actually items from a specific religious ritual or symbolic motif. So, it's very, very hard to get these things right. That brings us to your methodology. You take an agnostic approach. You don't take reports at face value, but you also don't dismiss them outright. How can someone assess a UFO report objectively? That seems like a strange concept to people. Yes, it's strange for people, and I know many who still don't like that I do this. For me, as a historian, part of it comes from not feeling qualified to rule on some of these questions. I think certain aspects should be left to meteorologists, physicists, astronomers, or engineers. People far more qualified than I am to determine what's possible and what's anomalous. But the other part is that this approach allows me to get to what interests me most, human beings. In the introduction to the book, I say that UFOs don't make history. People make UFOs make history. That's really the main point. I'm interested in the human part of this story. As far as we know today, UFOs don't have a natural history, but a human one. Everything about them has to do with our perception, speculation, and discussion of them. The social fact of UFOs is very real and needs to be documented. Whether these things also have a natural history, I'll leave to the researchers who make a living studying that. When you review these reports, I'm sure some seem obviously fake at first glance, but others come from people, like pilots, who have no interest in UFOs and speak out at great personal and professional cost. Have you encountered truly credible cases? Yes, many of them can be, or at least contain credible elements. In the 1950s, there was one case investigated by the U.S. Air Force that really set them back. Two experienced civilian pilots for Eastern Airlines, sensible men, saw a very strange object during flight. They could even make out details, and it didn't resemble anything they'd ever seen before. It was eerie and strange. They had no explanation for it, and certainly no reason to invent one. They weren't seeking fame, and this wasn't an era when people could profit from such stories. Then there's the Lunny Zamora case from the 1960s. A police officer in the American Southwest who stopped his car thinking he'd seen a crash. He saw a strange object with figures in white suits working around it. Then they ran back into it. By all accounts, he was a mild-mannered, cool-headed man with no interest in publicity. In radio interviews, he sounds very shy. It's another case where you think it's hard not to believe he saw something. Then you try to come up with possible explanations. How have reports evolved over time? Do they change as the surrounding culture changes? Some things haven't changed much. The vast majority describe patterns of light, orbs, or spheres moving in strange ways, and then dispersing silently. That has remained relatively constant since the beginning. But people have also seen cigar-shaped objects or triangles. These forms are quite common worldwide. What has changed more dramatically over the years and across regions is the description of the occupants of these craft, the aliens themselves. In the 1950s and 60s, people often described them as robots, like the Tin Man from The Wizard of Oz. We don't tend to see robots anymore. Another very common theme in the 50s and 60s was the so-called little men. They weren't usually described as green, just small, and, for some reason, almost always male. They were typically about 4 feet tall, though in places like Malaysia, some reports claimed they were under 6 inches. Another common detail was that they wore old-fashioned diving suits. Then, by the 1970s and 80s, you get a veritable zoo of beings insect-like creatures, large, hairy beings resembling Bigfoot or Sasquatch, especially common in South America and the Soviet Union. What we now know as the Greys weren't actually that common until Whitley Strieber's book Communion was published in 1987. From then on, the idea of what an alien looks like really crystallized. That must be one of the things skeptics point to. The fact that culture shapes what people see makes it easier to call it a mass delusion. Yes, skeptics do that. What they'd like to do is be even more specific and explain why someone saw something at a particular time. They'll say, there was a TV show 2 weeks before the sighting, and the person insists they never saw it, and the debate goes back and forth. I firmly believe that media of all kinds play a formative role in shaping how people think, speak, and even see things. But from my perspective, and here I may differ from skeptics, I don't think that explains things away. It just means people are human beings doing what we always do. When something truly strange or unexplainable happens to us, it's not surprising that we reach for analogies and metaphors. It helps us say, well, it was kind of like this. These debates continue today, but a lot has changed too. We're at the tail end of our own UFO, or rather UAP, wave. This time, after U.S. Navy footage of mysterious flying objects was released in 2017, we saw a very different reaction from officials. There were Senate hearings, task forces were formed, even NASA got involved. What happened? Is it because everyone in government now also grew up with UFO lore? A number of things have changed, making it now seem legitimate to ask questions about this, even respectable to discuss it in academia. One factor is the reality of new surveillance systems and detection sensors. In the US, China, and Russia, there's awareness of these technologies. And, of course, a kind of keeping up with the Joneses attitude about them. The spread of drones is another. Drones are everywhere now. A few years ago, I spoke with a Swedish ufologist who said sightings involving drones had increased dramatically. As for the extraterrestrial dimension, since the late 1990s, astronomers have discovered that exoplanets are quite common. That introduced the idea that planets are everywhere, and that habitable ones are likely. I think that's made it easier to see these things as possible. I've even heard skeptics say they believe extraterrestrial civilizations probably exist. They just don't think they're visiting us. There are also people actively lobbying to make others take this seriously. Billionaire Robert Bigelow has poured a lot of money into the cause. Lobbyists now have the ear of certain U.S. politicians who see the issue as politically useful in some way. I think we should always be a bit cynical about politicians. They tend to be pragmatic. The fact that they're engaging with the topic doesn't necessarily mean they care about UFOs, but rather about what they can gain from it. What are politicians trying to gain by taking it up? I can imagine they use it as a way to say they'll keep money away from the military, because the military can't be trusted as an honest broker on this issue. The number one thing I keep hearing again and again from people on these committees, even those who are less invested, is spending and classification. U.S. military secrecy has been a top priority since World War II, certainly since the Manhattan Project, and it's only grown over the years. After 9/11, it doubled or tripled. That makes the UFO UAP issue a perfect example for people to say, we have all these whistleblowers claiming all this stuff is happening. We've heard nothing about it. You're hiding it from us. Everything's classified, so we want in. One frustrating thing about coverage of these issues is that you get task forces, essentially military ones. People say ominous things, and when pressed, they respond that they'll explain the rest behind closed doors. And no, scientists can't access the bases where sightings occurred. Now that NASA is involved, do you have more faith that civilian science will get to the bottom of it? Yes, exactly. I completely agree with you. That's why I always tell people that I personally don't think these military intelligence units will ever be key to solving these questions. I don't think you'll ever get it from them. I'm also not someone who believes in total transparency. Sometimes secrets do need to be kept. NASA's support for research in this area is unprecedented, and I think it's very welcome. I know many scientists who are starting to conduct research in this direction. The problem is that it hasn't yet led to funding. Most current efforts are shoestring, budget projects, and it's unclear whether real money will ever follow. For now, at least in the U.S. That hasn't happened. But there's hope among many researchers that this will change because the climate has shifted. Civilian scientists and researchers will be the key because they work in a world of transparency and openness that contractors and governments don't have. Do you think we'll ever get a solid answer? I suspect we'll be revisiting and speculating about this for a long time. The world has been wrestling with it for over 75 years, and even the most seasoned veterans of ufology will tell you that not much has changed. If serious, empirically minded researchers can get involved, maybe then we'll start to see real progress. But until then, it seems we're still stuck in a cycle largely driven by rumor and reference to evidence that never materializes. Or, as you said, people claim to have information but can only share it behind closed doors. That leaves us only with the mystery, which, I know, some people are perfectly happy with.